We're going to talk about user authentication. I'm going to talk about a couple of recipes for user authentication. If you are following along and you want to grab a copy of the slides, there's a PDF on my website called pragmaticwebsecurity.com. So you can grab them there and follow along if you prefer. All right. Without further ado, let's dive into authentication. What are we going to talk about? Well, we typically have a user who's trying to connect to a web application. It's something running on the server side, whether it's a backend web application, API. That doesn't matter too much for the topic we're going to talk about here. At some point, the user is going to authenticate with credentials. Traditional credentials, a username, password, something key-based. We'll talk about that in detail. And the backend will verify those credentials and respond with hopefully a positive response and a piece of authenticated state. Next time a request comes in, the user or the browser of the user typically or the application will send along that authenticated state to the backend, allowing it to make proper authorization decisions and issue a response in return. State propagation. So typically in web-based applications or even in mobile apps, we authenticate once and then propagate that state with a session or with a token or with something that you build yourself. What exactly doesn't matter here because we're going to focus on authentication. I'm not going to talk about stateful, stateless, and all of those things. I did that last year, I think, in the real Lokomokosek in Hawaii. And I'm going to talk about authentication this year. All right. The session is titled Serving the Right Recipe. There's a very good reason for that. First of all, that reason is I'm a chef. Apart from doing AppSec, I actually went to cooking school and got my chef's degree. Unfortunately, I don't have much time to cook anymore. As Colleen said, there's security people are always too busy, but I like to pull in some food-related things into my talks. In this session, we're going to talk about the really crappy things that you think are actually kind of nice, but turn out way worse than you expect. You can kind of guess what that's going to be about. We're going to talk about the super high-end food. If you're ever in Barcelona, Spain, after this whole pandemic thing, you should check out this restaurant with absolutely great food. And of course, we're going to talk simple food, which is just as delicious as well. A good slice of pizza, for example, or whatever your food of choice is. That always gives you comfort. It gets the job done, and nobody really cares that it's not that pretty. All right. I had a slide about myself, but the introduction kind of took that away from me. So if you want to know more about what I do, go to my website, pragmaticwebsecurity.com. And basically it comes down to training or security advisory services on helping companies build more secure applications. All right. With this out of the way, let's start talking about authentication. Let's talk about this dreaded mechanism called passwords. Everybody loves passwords and everybody hates passwords. So we're going to use this as kind of the baseline of what we're going to talk about. I promise I'm not going to talk about password security. There's already a lot of information about that out there, so I don't think it's very useful to start going over that again and again. Instead, I want to focus on alternative technologies. How does password authentication work? In a nutshell, you send a username and a password through the browser or through a mobile app to a backend, which has a hashed version of the password or should have a hashed version of the password. And they will compare the hashed password against the hashed version. And if everything checks out, the API is going to be happy. This is, unfortunately, I would say, still the de facto standard for user authentication. And I'm kind of hoping that we can change that in the future. Like I said, this will be the baseline. So I have this recipe card, which gives you a very clean overview of what this mechanism has to offer. So a password it's actually a shared secret, even though the stored version is a hashed version, the server still sees the plain text password when it comes in. That's essentially what is going on right here. Passwords have some benefits. So, like I said, we'll have a baseline. We'll look at a couple of benefits from passwords and a couple of drawbacks, and we're going to try to keep the benefits while remediating the drawbacks. Passwords, whether you like them or not, they're lightweight. They are minimal overhead, just a string you send around and compare. Users really understand password. Well, not really understand. Users know how passwords work. If you explain a password to a non-technical user, most people will not be confused about what a password is. They will be a bit confused about how to handle passwords, but that's a different story. But conceptually, it's an easy concept. And maybe the most important benefit of a password is that it's actually portable, which is also a very big drawback, but it's portable across devices. If you sign up for a website on your laptop and you move to your phone, you can log in with the same username and password there on another device, and so on and so on. That's something we actually would like to keep with authentication mechanisms, because otherwise you're going to be stuck with authenticating with the same device over and over again. Drawbacks, I think if you've been in the infosec world for a bit, then you'll be absolutely aware of the drawbacks of passwords. So passwords are often reused by users across applications, which results in massive problems. So if you have a phishing attack, people can obtain a password and use that on the applications where it's valid. Passwords can be stolen for one application and used on another, or they can simply be brute forced by guessing the name of your dog or children or whatever you prefer as your password generation mechanism. So passwords, they work. They're the dirty thing. It doesn't look great. If you start to look deeper, there's a lot of issues with credential stuffing and all of these things. So passwords are what you really don't want to use, even though it's still what we use today. The good news is I will have a better option towards the end of this talk. So I hope you will join me on this journey and we will figure out what the better option is. First, let's talk about the quick and dirty thing that gets the job done, the slice of pizza, if you want it that way. What if we just remove the password altogether? What if we use kind of a magic link mechanism? So I'm going to go to a website. I'm going to say like, hey, I'm Philippe and I would like to log in. Here's my email address or here's my phone number or whatever. And the backend will generate a magic link with a one-time token and send me that link over email or an SMS message or whatever channel you prefer. I click the link, very simple, and the website opens again. This time I'm authenticated as Philippe and I can do whatever I want on that application. Seems simple, seems straightforward, and it actually is in practice. So in practice, this works really well, actually, because it gives the user the option to, there's no need to remember a password, there's no reusing a password, it's just clicking a link in their email and they are authenticated. How do you implement this in practice? Well, there's a couple of different options. And honestly, if you generate a one-time token, you can put in that token whatever you want. But if you want a more structured way of doing this, there's a W3C specification called DID, or Decentralized Identifier, which has an interesting format to represent a globally unique identifier. So that might be an option to look at. But of course, you can also build your own mechanism as long as you ensure that it's not vulnerable to attacks. You can increase security. For example, OutZero, one of the identity services I often work with, they have this passwordless authentication mechanism with magic links, but they require that step 1 and 4 happens in the same browser. So they require starting the flow with following the magic link. They both have to happen in the same browser. Otherwise, they consider that to be an invalid authentication, which increases security against somebody intercepting an email or a text message and using the magic link to authenticate as a user. So that might be a good option if you want to make this a bit more secure. Of course, the drawback here is that the security of this mechanism basically all falls on the third-party service you're using. So either you're trusting an email service or Gmail or whatever custom email service you're using, or the user's cell phone provider to make sure that that part is secure so that your magic link is also secure, which it's marked in red because this is a major drawback, which only makes this kind of useful for non-security sensitive applications. So I would say if you're building something like a recipe website where almost all data is public anyway, and there's no real sensitive data to protect, then this is a really simple and straightforward mechanism to avoid having to handle passwords and all of the security considerations around passwords. Of course, if you're building a banking application, I would strongly recommend to not use this because if you have regulations in your country, it's probably not going to like what you're doing right here. So let me wrap this part up. It's a simple mechanism. There's not much to say about this except that it works in the cases that you want to use it. So we have no passwords, no shared secrets, which is kind of nice. It's easy to understand. It's easy to explain to a user, even a non-technical user, like, hey, just provide your email address and click the button and you get a link and you're logged in. Very easy, very straightforward. Benefits, easy to understand. It's portable. It's a bit less susceptible to phishing than passwords because even in a phish scenario, the mail would still contain an actual link to the real website. So phishing is a lot less of an issue when you're using magic links. And if you look at this objectively, it's probably not worse than a site which authenticates with passwords and then has the reset password feature over email. So many recovery mechanisms just send you an email which allows you to reset your password, but that basically comes down to the same thing. It's basically the same mechanism, just to reset a password instead of just logging you in directly. But if somebody has access to your mailbox, they will be able to log in with this mechanism or recover your password with the other mechanism. Drawbacks here, you rely on sort of implicit authentication. There's no guarantee that user is even present, just that a device with an inbox or an SMS message is publicly visible. That's basically it. So if you have a text message preview on your phone and I can see your phone even though it's locked, I could still derive that magic link maybe and enter it somewhere. So that might be a risk. Of course, email and SMS have their own security issues. If you're worried about SIM swapping and you have an SMS-based mechanism, this is definitely not going to be useful. But again, if you're worried about SIM swapping, then you're probably building a pretty sensitive application, and this is a no-go anyway. You want a more secure and a stronger authentication mechanism for those applications. But already a bit better than passwords. And actually, I'm going to have an overview slide at the end with some recommendations. I would recommend this mechanism for any non-sensitive application, where a breach would be would have a very low or almost no impact. Of course, for sensitive applications, we want something better. We don't want passwords. We definitely don't want magic links. So let's start working towards the fancy fine dining of user authentication. And that's going to be based on keys. Cryptographic keys, public-private keys, or a key pair, as we call it, is basically the strongest authentication mechanism we have. It's used a lot in server-to-server communication, and it also plays a crucial role in user-to-server authentication as well. Let's look at the concept first, just to make sure we're on the same page, and then we're going to look at specific implementations, and a very concrete implementation, which is rapidly becoming the standard today, called web authentication. So what happens in a public-private authentication scenario is that the user has a private key and the server has a public key. And the user or the client application, the browser or the mobile app is going to generate a signature using that key and send that signature to the backend, which will act as an authentication mechanism. So it's going to be like, hey, I'm Philippe, and here's a signature that proves that I possess this private key, which allows the backend to verify that signature with a public key and respond. So we're moving from possessing a shared secret, the password, to possessing a private key that only one person has and nobody else needs to have. You can even use this to authenticate to different applications with the same key, because all of them will have the public key, which is public information. Nobody cares about public keys, as long as the private key remains private. So why does this work? Well, because these things are linked together. In case you're not too big on crypto, don't worry, I'm not a crypto expert either, but I'm very familiar with the security properties that you get from cryptographic functions such as signing. So what we basically do is we have a signing function. RSA is probably the most well-known and asymmetric algorithm here, most well-known, even though we have better alternatives to use today. We provide some data to sign, which will typically be a challenge of some sort, along with a private key, and out will come this signature, which is, in this case, encoded in a human-readable way or a simple text format to send in requests and responses. We send this to the backend. The backend will have the public key and will use the verification mechanism to ensure that this data is indeed valid. This basically is a dedicated function. You feed it three things: the data as input, the public key that you think is the right public key, and the actual signature, and it will give you a true or false response. This works because the public key is linked to the private key. Every private key has a public key and vice versa, and there's a unique mathematical link between both keys. So if you get a positive result, it means that the data that has been signed is indeed that the signature for the data is indeed valid. The data hasn't changed, and the key that you used is the public key that belongs to the private key of the user that you expected. If the result is negative, if the verification function fails, then something is wrong. Either the key is wrong, or the data is wrong, or the signature is wrong, but we don't really care because that's not a valid piece of data. So we kind of bail out and we don't consider this to be a signed challenge, and we drop all of that. All right, that's the concept here. So let's look at a couple of applications. Where can we use something like this, preferably without going to a lot of trouble of setting all of this up? Well, a first option is the use of TLS. TLS is something that we most commonly use to authenticate servers. So if you connect to a certain server, it's going to present you with a certificate, and your browser will verify that you're talking to the real locomocosec.com instead of a forgery. Well, you can use that same mechanism on the client as well, which means that the client now also has a certificate with a public key and a private key, and the server has the same thing, and they use these certificates to set up a TLS connection with mutual TLS or MTLS. And that basically gives you a communication channel with all the properties of TLS, confidentiality and integrity, plus both parties can verify each other's identities. So by verifying the server certificate, the browser knows it's talking to the real locomocosec, and by verifying my client certificate, locomocosec could determine that I am indeed Philippe de Ryck. Actually, this mechanism is something that in Belgium we have electronic identity cards, EIDs, and every EID has such a TLS certificate and key embedded on it, so you can use that to set up such an MTLS connection. That would allow locomocosec to verify the certificate issued by the Belgian government so that they can determine that they actually trust that information, which proves that I am Philippe de Ryck, or at least somebody has stolen my ID and PIN code to use that TLS certificate in my place. But that's always a problem with authentication. Sounds pretty cool, right? MTLS, mutual TLS, is the holy grail of server-to-server communication. That's what frameworks like Istio are using out of the box. And you can also use this for user-based authentication if you really want. Looks like this in the browser. So browsers actually support that. Here's a screenshot I just stole from a website. I linked at it in the bottom because I honestly didn't want to go to the trouble of setting this all up in a real scenario, so I could just take a screenshot. That tells you enough. This is painful to set up. This is very difficult to manage. Users have no idea how to handle certificates, and it's absolutely not portable. So you'd have to export this with a private key and then import it on a different machine or in a different browser, and it's going to be a nightmare to handle that. So unfortunately, in practice, even though the mechanism is really good, it's never or almost never used for user-based authentication unless you have some specific middleware such as the EID card. And even then, they've moved to other mechanisms for identifying as a Belgian citizen. All right. So if you can't use MTLS, or if MTLS is not practical, what about other solutions? Well, there's one other mechanism that has been used in the past quite a bit, but it's getting kind of outdated, which is the use of a mobile app to handle all of this. So instead of having this TLS certificate living in your browser or on your machine, what if we just have a dedicated mobile app? What if you want to authenticate to locomocosec.com and you also have the locomocosec official app installed on your cell phone? Then you could use that to sign such a challenge and prove that you possess that private key and that it's indeed Philippe. So that would work like this. I'm Philippe and I want to log in. The backend will look up account details like, oh yeah, Philippe, here's the application, and we can generate a challenge and a push notifications to the installed application. So I can now take my phone, I can approve this authentication request, which will sign the challenge and send the response back to the server, allowing the server to verify whether that's indeed a valid challenge. That's considered to be enough for authentication because I possess the device, which can use biometrics to unlock the key. And basically, I prove that I have this authentication factor, which results in an authentication, a successful option here. The signing step, if you use applications like this, there's apps that are dedicated applications for handling authentication. They give you all the details of what's going on. Like, hey, I'm trying to authenticate you or a browser on this website and with these details, and do you want that, yes or no? And typically, the key installed on mobile devices is locked by biometrics or a PIN code, so you cannot easily use that unless it's the real user of that device. And that's basically what key-based authentication can do. So let's take a look at that recipe card right here. No shared secrets, which is really good. It takes away a lot of the problems of passwords. There's no brute forcing anymore. There's no stealing private keys from other applications because only the client has that private key, often stored in a secure way in the operating system so it cannot be extracted. So this is really good. That's why key-based authentication is really good, also for server-to-server communication. Benefits: only the public key needs to be shared. That's kind of good. You can do this with multiple applications. That's nice. You can leverage OS storage features, the keychain on a public, on a Mac OS, for example, or the mobile key storage options like Android has Strongbox, for example, where you can keep keys on the device, make them non-extractable. This kind of pattern also works well for native mobile applications where there's no browser involved. If it's just app to API in the custom authentication mechanism, that can rely on this key-based mechanism as well, leveraging again the OS features to store keys securely. What are the drawbacks? Well, the drawbacks is that we need this client-side mechanism to handle keys, especially in a browser-based setup. If you want to do this for 10, 15 websites, you'll have to install 10 to 15 apps, which may not be very practical. And it might work for the big applications that kind of everybody has, but it will not work for a small recipe site like, yeah, also install this app, which we had to develop so you can attend. That's not going to work in practice. But we'll get there. Additionally, we're implementing kind of a custom authentication scheme, which is asking for trouble, as in these things are really notoriously difficult to get right. There's a lot of threats to take into account and a lot of things that can go wrong. So it's highly recommended to not do this yourself, but instead leverage an existing standard for doing this, which is the topic of the next recipe, which is web authentication. What if we could do this in a browser natively? What if the browser just exposed an API allowing us to use an authenticator such as a YubiKey or other USB security key, a mobile phone, an Android phone, or even your Touch ID on your MacBook or a Windows 10 machine, which has support for this built in? What if we could just leverage those features to generate such a key and expose the public key to the backend, and then we can use this key-based authentication mechanism without having to develop a custom solution? And that's exactly what the web authentication spec set out to do and has achieved in doing. And that's absolutely beautiful. The devices at the bottom are called authenticators. It's basically a simple interface that supports the generation of keys, the extraction of public keys, and the signing of challenges. That's in a nutshell what it comes down to. So the authenticator is at the bottom. And I want to go into a little bit more detail here because web authentication is absolutely the future, and you should be fully aware of how this works in at least on a high level so that you know whether this is going to be useful for you or whether you want to wait for implementing that. The first step I want to talk about is registration. During signup, when you either have logged in with your username and password and want to add an authenticator, or if you are creating a new account and you don't want a password, you just want to generate this key pair with your authenticator, that's what's going to happen right now. In this case, it's a clean signup. So I'm going to go to locomocosec.com for the first time. I'm going to fill out like, I'm Philippe, here's my email address, and I would like to register for your very cool website. The backend will ask the browser in that case, like, oh yeah, that's pretty cool. Can you create a key and sign a challenge, please? And the browser is going to contact this is basically a JavaScript API. So the backend sends a piece of JavaScript to the browser. I'm going to show you that in a couple of slides. And the JavaScript API will tell the browser, like, we need an authenticator to create a key and sign a challenge. If there's an authenticator available, that authenticator, such as a YubiKey, for example, will generate a private public key pair, sign the challenge with a private key, and send the public key and the signed challenge back. That goes to the server. The server verifies that the signature is indeed valid and stores that public key with my user account on locomocosec.com. And that's basically the setup here. So we now have created a key pair. YubiKeys do something specific, but if it's on a mobile app, the private key is stored on your mobile device and the public key is shared with the website you just registered an account with. And this is absolutely awesome. In addition to all the goodness you see on the slide, there's one implicit thing. The browser will include the origin of the web page in the whole process. And that's going to be relevant in a couple of slides. The origin in this case is https locomocosec.com, which basically links this key uniquely to the Locomocosec website and not to some crappy phishing site impersonating Locomocosec. So what does this look like in practice? Well, if you have this on a website, there's a demo website, webauthn.io, which has this full implementation, so you can try it out right now if you want to. I tried this out on my MacBook, and I got the option to either use a USB security key, such as a YubiKey, or to use the built-in Touch ID sensor on the touch bar. I chose for the Touch ID sensor because I was too lazy to unplug something from my very limited amount of USB ports to plug in my YubiKey. So we're going to do this with the Touch Bar ID, Touch ID. I'm using Brave, so Brave is prompting like, hey, do you want to touch your, which says like, hey, Brave is trying to authenticate you to webauthn.io. So I did just that. And then the site is asking if I want to share information about the authenticator. So the site actually asks for authenticator information so they can determine how strong the authenticator is and what kind of authenticator it is. And in this case, I allowed that as well. All of this happened with this piece of code. So essentially, the navigator.credentials is the API we're using, and we create an API with a bunch of parameters. I'm going to quickly walk through this. I have the link to the guide at the end, which will give you a lot more details on what exactly all of this means. A quick walkthrough. Line 3 to 5 identifies the relying party. That's basically the backend that is doing the authentication. On line 8 to 11, you'll find some user details, of which explicitly the ID on line 8 is really relevant, because that ID will be used later to link this back to an account on the server. On line 14, we have the very descriptive algorithm parameters with a value of -7, which refers to a list of algorithms. In this case, it's elliptic curve public keys with a SHA-256 signing algorithm. Again, these things are documented. You can find this list and you can make your own selection of what you want to use. This is a very common and secure by default value. On line 16, we tell the browser what kind of authenticator we want. In this case, we want cross-platform. That's basically we're asking the user to use something that can be that is portable. So a USB security key would be portable because I can plug that in all kinds of machines. Unless you have different machines with different types of USB, then you need 15 dongles to make that work. But you get the idea. It's a portable USB key. Awesome. The one I used, the Touch ID built into my MacBook, that's basically only useful on one machine. I'm actually presenting on a different machine here. And I would not be able to reuse those credentials because they're on my other machine sitting somewhere else. That's in a nutshell what's going on here. The API looks pretty horrible because there's a lot of parameters, but in a nutshell, it hides a lot of the complexity and it's absolutely awesome. So once you've registered, how do you authenticate? Well, actually, it's not that difficult. Again, I go to the website. I'm like, hey, I'm Philippe, because you need to give an identifier so that the backend knows which keys to retrieve. And I want to log in. And the backend will look up my key material, be like, oh yeah, Philippe, you have I have a couple of YubiKeys. So in this case, it would be like, oh, I have 4 potential credentials here. I'm going to take those identifiers and send them back to the browser along with a challenge. The backend doesn't know which one of my keys is here. It cannot use that to track me. All it can do is use the API to tell the JavaScript API to say like, hey, here's a bunch of keys. Do you have any of these available? And if so, can you sign the challenge, please? So the authenticator is going to jump in. It's going to pop up the dialog like, hey, do you want to sign this? Yeah, I'm fine. And off we go. Then we have the sign challenge, which goes back to the backend, allowing the backend to verify that that challenge is indeed validly signed. So the signature is valid, which tells it that it was one of my keys used to generate that signature, telling it that is probably that I'm present here and that the authentication is valid. Like before, the browser includes the origin here. The origin in our example would be https locomocosec.com. And that's a good thing, because if you try this on a phishing website like Locomocosec with zeros instead of O's, the origin would be different, and the authenticator would not sign the challenge, or the challenge would not be valid to use on the actual Locomoco sec. So this specification, the 5.2/web authentication specification, has phishing protection built in. And actually, I don't have the article here, but Google deployed security keys for their personnel a while ago, and they eliminated phishing or successful phishing attempts by 98 or 100% even. It's really, really effective. The UI, once you've done the setup, it's very simple. The website asks for authentication. The pop-up comes like, hey, there's touch bar activity. You touch the Touch ID sensor, and off you go. And the authentication is everything else happens under the hood, and you're good to go. Code-wise, again, not very difficult. It's the Navigator Credentials API. Instead of create, it's get. We provide a list of potential credentials, the keys registered to my account with this website. That's line 5 to 9, and that's basically it. So essentially, by doing that, we can easily ask the user to use one of their keys. If they have multiple registered, they will get a pop-up asking the user, like, which one do you want to use? Like, oh, let's use the YubiKey for this site, and off you go. Which one you use, as long as it's registered, doesn't matter. It will result in a successful authentication. All right. A quick word about recovery. I'm running a bit late, so I'm going to start to have to speed up a bit. Quick word about recovery. If you lose your authenticators, it's very likely that you cannot recover your account. That's a weakness here. You can rely on other mechanisms, like, let's just use a link in email to reset authenticators, but then you're reducing the security of your system, because then it comes back to having access to an email account again. This is either very useful if you have multiple YubiKeys, which is why I have multiple, because if I lose one, I can still authenticate with the others, so I'm good. And also for enterprise applications, if you have technical support to handle account recovery, it's a whole different story if it's not automatic. Web authentication is the goal of the spec is to replace passwords, and I think it will actually succeed in doing so in the future. There's a lot of support. It's widely supported in various applications. Google allows Android phones to act as authenticators. Windows 10 is heavily investing in using web authentication instead of passwords, and it's really going to be the future. So keep an eye on this specification and its implementations. Recipe card here. Well, it's widely supported, strong key-based authentication. Like, it's really the holy grail of what you're doing here, and that's absolutely awesome. We have the potential to use hardware keys as authenticators, which is also very, very good, because YubiKeys, for example, are very good security-wise, and it's almost impossible to extract the secret from such a key, making it really good. And you have built-in privacy protection. Drawbacks, it's a new mechanism, so it means a new workflow for users. You can only replace passwords in a controlled environment, because in a normal environment, people will be using a mix between different mechanisms. So some users will not have a USB security key or a device that supports this, so they still want to use passwords, and you'll have to support a mix of these things. Server-side code is sensitive, of course, but there's libraries to handle the signature verification, so I recommend to leverage that. And then we have one more. I'll be brief about this one, and that's login with Retrograde or login with Google or whatever. And that's basically OpenID Connect. And OpenID Connect is not an authentication mechanism, it's an authentication protocol. And I only want to talk about it here to make sure you have the full context of what that thing means in practice. OIDC allows you to offload authentication to a central identity provider. So again, you tell the backend, I want to log in, and the backend is like, yeah, but I'm not handling any authentication, screw that. I'm going to send you to this identity provider with a redirect mechanism in an OIDC flow. And the identity provider will handle authentication, will ask the user, who are you? Oh, it's Philippe. Oh, can you give me your password or sign this or do whatever they think is necessary to authenticate the user? And after that, they will provide an identity token back to the application requesting authentication. That identity token contains information about the user, allowing the backend to establish who I am. Like, oh, it's Philippe, and here's his unique user identifier that I know this person, and I can now complete the authentication. That's essentially what OpenID Connect does. OIDC is really, really useful because it allows you to support this central authentication with things like single sign-on. If you have a bunch of applications all using authentication, by using OIDC, you have one authentication point instead of having several in each application implemented it right there. How does this authentication step work in practice? Well, you get a JSON Web Token, which is an identity token, which contains the user account information. It contains some metadata like the issuer and the audience, but it most importantly contains the subject, line 9. And the subject is the user's unique identifier. This identifier will never change for this user account, so you can map that to a user in the application's database, and you can bootstrap an authenticated session from that point on. Final note here, OpenID Connect allows the delegation of authentication to the identity provider. It doesn't replace user authentication, because at the identity provider, there's still going to be traditional authentication, which often is with usernames and passwords, also supports multi-factor or even more advanced key-based solutions. So keep in mind that OIDC just moves the authentication to a different place, to a centralized service, instead of replacing the mechanism altogether. All right. Let me wrap it up very briefly. So benefits of OIDC: supporting multiple clients with a single user account, with a single identity service. No need to re-implement the same thing over and over again. Works extremely well with an enterprise application portfolio, or if you have a large-scale application like sign in with Google, works well too. It doesn't replace user authentication, so you'll still need to figure out how to handle that correctly. You'll need to have an identity provider which you can self-host or buy as a service. And it's kind of complex to understand and tricky to get right. This introduction or this story of OIDC was extremely short. If you want to know more, I have an online course that goes into a lot more depth with a discount code for all your LocoMocoSec viewers. So go there and learn about that, I would say. And that brings me to the wrap-up, an overview of the recipes that we talked about. Password-based, well-known, has a lot of vulnerabilities, really hard to fix them. So my recommendation here is avoid when possible. I know you'll probably have to support it, but if you can move away, please do so. For non-sensitive applications, like where you really don't care that much, where there's nothing bad can happen if somebody gets compromised, a magic link is probably the easiest way forward. Key-based authentication is very much preferred, but is going to be very difficult in web-based applications. That's why we have the Web Authentication API. Supported in all major browsers, supported by underlying operating systems. Absolutely amazing. Please look into that. Look at the demos, look at the APIs, look at how to implement this in your applications. And then finally, if you want to offload this, if you want to defer authentication to a central service, OpenID Connect is your friend there, and you can implement your strong authentication on the identity provider to have the best of both worlds, I would say. All right. If you want to know more about the requirements for secure authentication, I can recommend the OWASP ASVS, the Application Security Verification Standard, because it covers a couple of very important authentication requirements. You can find that on the ASVS homepage, which is referred to here in the list of useful references. All right. Again, grab a copy of the slides. This slide is in there as well, and you can start learning more about these different recipes on how to implement them correctly. But I want to thank you for watching. I hope this was a useful overview. And if you have any questions, I think we have a little bit of time left to answer those. And otherwise, you can connect with me on social media and reach out to me there.
We absolutely have time for questions. Thank you much, Philippe, and please give him a virtual round of applause. I know as a chef, you said you don't have as much time, but let's be honest. You were cooking just there, like you're chopping up and breaking down the content like those Benihanas. You want some magic link? No, cool. Well, let me serve you up some web auth with the side of usability. So let's get into some questions here. We'll start with this one. From the many companies you work with, what do you see as the biggest challenge to getting end user auth right?
Buy-in, the convincing people that they actually need to do more. I mean, I see a lot of companies where they kind of know what the right thing is, but even internally, it's often hard to convince people to do the right thing, because it takes effort. I mean, passwords, putting them in a text file somewhere is really straightforward, really easy, no hassle, but the security properties are less than ideal. So ideally, you want to move to something like web authentication, give every employee a security hardware key, and so on and so on, and preferably for customers as well. But that's a very complicated and long process to do that. And I would say that's the major hurdle, the overcoming the impact on user experience.
Okay. Next question for you. Any rough idea from some of your research what the adoption rates are for key-based auth, web auth? You kind of had a breakdown there, but for some of the later ones that we're trying to push people towards, do you know what those adoption rates might look like out there?
I don't have hard data. I have a gut feeling, and it's not very good. So honestly, everything involving non-employee users is going to be username password based. Almost everything. It's an unfortunate reality. I think internally in companies, it's a lot better because there's some kind of way to force this on users, so that kind of helps, and it's also a more controlled environment. I mean, if you have to offer support for a few million users all over the world to recover their accounts in case something goes wrong, that's a whole different story than if you have to support 10,000 employees in a controlled environment with a proper help desk system. So I don't have any concrete numbers, but I'm afraid it's not that good.
Nope, totally fine. Okay, so you shared some of the additional resources out there. Are there any resources that you're aware of or that you currently have in your arsenal on building strong security in IoT devices when it comes to authentication?
Um, I'm going to be honest here. No, not really. I haven't looked into IoT at all, so I would not be able to give you a reasonable response here. My apologies.
No, that's okay. You're only one man, and you've already done so much for us. Okay, and then last question, more of a philosophical here. Thoughts on JWT JSON Web Token security as it's used in Open ID Connect?
Yeah, that's a can of worms. Honestly, JSON Web Tokens in OpenID Connect are used correctly. The specification is very precise on how to use them and what to use them for. So there's no major issues there. Of course, if you go and implement all of the verification steps yourself, it you'll run into some issues, and bad incidents have happened in the past. So that's one of the drawbacks. You'll often find people criticizing JWTs because the spec is um, very open and very imprecise, resulting in potential very vulnerable implementations. But on the other hand, none of the alternatives really seem to move forward. So it's a very difficult question. So my advice is, if you use JSON Web Tokens, try to use a decent library. Try to have at least one person in the dev team that really understands the security challenges of verifying JSON Web Tokens, and carefully check all the pieces of data that need to be checked, which is the biggest challenge here. But for OIDC, that is mostly done in libraries nowadays, and these libraries definitely do a pretty fine job of getting that right.